Thanks so much. Oh, my goodness. Well, listen, with all this talk about prayer, lead pastor, baptisms, conversions, what's really important is how many of you are rooting for the Kansas City Chiefs? Or how about the 49ers? I mean, there's all right. See, Josue, you can't get them to clap for whatever. I just mentioned the 49ers, and I have never rooted for the 49ers in my life. So I don't know what's going on in my world, but nonetheless, there's a little bit of personal interest there along the way. Hey, I want you to turn to John. Let's get to the real stuff, all right? Those of you who are visiting think, what kind of a church is this? They're just talking about the Super Bowl. How many of you are rooting for No, I won't mention that. You know where that was going, weren't you? You knew. Anyway, turn to John 11. John 11. Listen, these baptisms are a tribute to miracles. And I don't live with the folks who were baptized. I know a little bit of their stories, and you heard a bit of that this morning. But when God works in your heart, you respond. And that's a miracle, because the Bible says that we are new creations. Yeah, by the way, if you need a Bible, raise your hand, and we'll give you one, all right? Use it today and use it beyond this point as well. So in this context, we're talking about miracles. Now, John 11. So there are 4 Gospels in the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They cover a lot of the same material, but John particularly focuses on a few of Jesus' miracles in his ministry. The first miracle being the miracle of the changing of the water into wine at the wedding ceremony in Cana of Galilee, where he bails out the caterer. But the last of Jesus' miracles that's recorded in the Gospel of John is the resurrection of Lazarus. And Josue took us beautifully through that story last week as we were reminded that Jesus showing up late after his burial didn't mean that Jesus forgot or was delayed or just didn't think it was important. It all had to do with an illustration of a resurrection, a permanent resurrection that's going to take place someday, not only for Jesus, but also for us. And Lazarus was a picture of that. But every moment of, and just to put these things in context, every moment of what happens during these next few weeks as we go through the book of John and the story of Jesus as recorded by the Apostle John, directs attention toward the cross, but it focuses on 2 people, Jesus and Lazarus. I mean, it's kind of a unique dynamic, because here you've got this guy Lazarus that people want to see, and I'm always amazed that the focus would be totally on Lazarus, but actually they're looking at Lazarus as a reason to kill Jesus. And I would think that Lazarus would have all kinds of press conferences where the reporters and the authors and the movie directors and the bloggers would be asking him questions like, so where were you for 4 days? Who did you see? What was it like? Who told you you had to come back? Were you upset at that? And how does it feel now? And do you know, Lazarus, have you thought about the fact that you got to die again? No, the focus was on the miracle worker. And Jesus' miracles polarized the population. I know in our culture today, we just feel like there's more polarization going on all the time, and these folks can't talk to these folks and all that kind of stuff. Let me tell you, back when Jesus was on earth, it was really polarized. And it even seemed to be getting worse. And there was no negotiation. It wasn't like Jesus said to the Jewish leaders, let's sit down and talk about this. Let's see if we can figure out some sort of way of coming to some resolution and debate this a little bit, and finally we'll bring some peace to our circumstances. No, in fact, here's what happened. And Josue left us sort of hanging a little bit last week because the Jewish leaders are now saying, we want to get the Sanhedrin together, this august body of 70 Jewish leaders plus the chief priest. We want to get together and we want to sort of clarify where things are because we are in charge of Jewish affairs in the nation of Israel during their Roman oversight. And I bet the Sanhedrin thought that they would fix things. I'll bet that they thought that if we get together and we discuss it and we come to some conclusions that somehow we'll solve the problems. Let me tell you, from a divine perspective, it was the meeting of the Sanhedrin that got the plot back on track again. They were used by God to accomplish God's purposes in sending Jesus to this earth. And so the stage is set and the tension increases and the lines are drawn and the prelude is over. And now we're getting to the real stuff because the plot is back on track. I always try to think, what was the perspective of the angels in heaven toward what was going on earth? And I kind of think, now I'm not an angel. I wasn't in heaven at the time. And yet I kind of think, I wonder if they're thinking, God the Father, the plan is off track. Jesus is performing miracles. That's not why he went to the earth. That's not why he went to this measly little planet in the middle of a measly little solar system, in the middle of a measly little galaxy in the middle of the universe. No, he went to redeem, to rescue his creation. But now that the Sanhedrin meets, the plan's back on track. Take a look. Chapter 11. Chapter 11, verse 40. Look at verse 45 and then jump back one line, okay? Jesus said to Lazarus, or said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. And again, at that point, after Lazarus has been resurrected, he is an attention getter, okay? Now, verse 45. Therefore, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did put their faith in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. And then the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. There's that group I was talking about. What are we accomplishing? They asked. Here's this man performing many miraculous signs, and if we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. And then one of them named Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, spoke up. You know nothing at all. That's a translation of you idiots, okay? Don't you realize that it's better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish? And now we have a little commentary on what Caiaphas just said in verse 51. He didn't say this on his own, but as high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the Jewish nation, and not only for that nation, but also for the scattered children of God, to bring them together and make them one. And so from that day on, they plotted to take his, what? Life. And therefore, Jesus no longer moved about publicly among the Jews. Instead, he withdrew to a region near the desert, to a village called Ephraim, where he stayed with his disciples. And when it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, many went up from the country to Jerusalem for their ceremonial cleansing before the Passover, and they kept looking for Jesus. And as they stood in the temple area, they asked one another, what do you think? Isn't he coming to the feast at all? Okay, this is the ancient version of the Super Bowl, okay? Isn't he coming to the feast at all? But the chief priests and Pharisees had given orders that if anyone found out where Jesus was, he should report it so that they might arrest him. Now, here's what I want to do in these next few moments. I want to describe 6 different responses to the resurrection of Lazarus. 6 responses. And I ask you, whenever there's a narrative going on, particularly when Jesus is on this earth and he is interacting with people, the best way we can put the Bible into practice is to say, if I had been there, where do I fit? Where would I fit? So I want you to do this. I want you to think through which of these reactions are yours. Now that's really how we apply what God has told us in the scriptures. So the first response is a response of many Jews, and it said back in verse 45, it says, many believed. They responded with belief. They believed because of the miracle. And that's a huge, huge response. But the second response is one that I want to dive into just a little bit longer. And it's a response of what I call defensive anger. Defensive anger. And this is the way that the Jewish leaders responded, because they had been embarrassed, they had been exposed, they had been undermined by Jesus. And the setting is this. If an incident takes place and there's unrest in the city of Jerusalem, guess who's going to sweep in and sort of take over the situation? The Romans. And if the Romans come in and take over the setting, then the Sanhedrin and those Jewish leaders will lose their influence. They will lose their control. And they express that. So if we have this Jesus pulling off miracles and it's creating conflict and polarization between the Jewish folks, then we will expect that the Romans will come in and we'll lose our influence. We'll lose our power. Now, I want you to notice that in this context, nobody denies the miracles. Nobody. Nobody's saying, oh, you know what, it was, Lazarus wasn't quite dead, he was just sort of sick. And they put him away for a few days. Nobody denies the miracles. And in this context, Jesus was messing with the plan of the Jewish leaders. And so they were trying to protect their own territory. And what did they want to do in order to protect their own territory? Let's kill him. So Caiaphas, look at this again, okay? Verse 49. Caiaphas, who's the high priest that year, he said, like I translated it, you idiots. And then he makes a statement and he does not even know what he's saying. So he's an idiot also. Verse 50. Don't you realize that it's better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish? Here's what he's saying. It is politically expedient. It is the lesser of two evils if one man dies, if Jesus dies, and it keeps us from being overpowered by the Romans again, and they'll come in and they'll make a mess of everything. So let's just kill Jesus, because it's better if one guy dies than that all of us die. And in that statement, he is actually explaining the gospel. So y'all, I'm not from that far south, but I'm going to say it anyway. Y'all, it is better that one man die than that all of you do. And that's the gospel. Jesus was your substitute, my substitute. Instead of me, he died instead of me. And it's either Jesus or the nation, according to Caiaphas. That's the gospel. It's either Jesus or you. A timeout. Some of us have wrestled with the issue of, if I become a Christian, what's that going to change in my life? If I become a Christian, what am I going to have to give up? Now, typically we think in that vein rather than what am I going to gain, but if I become a Christian, what am I going to give up? What is it going to change? I've earned this stuff. I have earned this position. I have earned my credibility and so on, and I'm going to protect it with everything I can. That's exactly what these Jewish leaders were saying. And let me tell you that if you're wrestling with the claims of Jesus and you're wondering, should I make that commitment? And then later on, as an evidence of that commitment, we do this baptism thing. No, there's no way I'm going to get wet in front of everybody. I work on my hair too much, for that. I don't want them to see my wet head along the way. I'm not going to. I want what I have, and I want to protect it with all I can. And we find ourselves limiting what God gets when we give our lives to Him, or when we think we should give our lives to Him. Do you know, just a few days earlier, recorded in Luke chapter 16, Jesus told a story about another Lazarus. He's a poor man, and he eats the garbage from the rich man's table. And both of them die. And the rich man goes to hell because he has no faith in Jesus. But Lazarus, who had nothing on the earth, went to the Abraham's bosom, which is a picture of heaven. And the rich man can see what's going on up here. And he says to Abraham, send somebody away from here. Send somebody from the dead to go tell my brothers about this place, because I don't want them here. Folks, when a person is in hell, it's amazing how missionary minded they become for those who are still on earth. And so the rich man says, send somebody back to tell my brothers, because I don't want them to come here. They're not looking for companionship. They're looking for grace and mercy for those brothers. And the answer is, look, if they don't believe what the Bible has to say, even if someone rises from the dead, they won't believe. And so I'd have to suggest that even the resurrection, and I'm talking about a different Lazarus, okay? The resurrection of Lazarus that Josue described last week may not be enough to convince people. Sometimes you can get defensively angry at the claims of Christ. Look at verse 56. Verse 56. So things have sort of, moved along a little bit, and Jesus isn't really showing up in public very much anymore. By the way, next week he arrives in Jerusalem. We'll describe that. The triumphal entry on Palm Sunday. But the next time you see Jesus in public, he'll be in chains. So here's what's going on. Verse 56. They kept looking for Jesus, and as they stood in the temple area, they asked one another, what do you think? Isn't he coming to the feast at all? I'll have to admit, here I am looking at pop culture, looking at the Super Bowl, looking at sports, all that kind of stuff. And if you're in Las Vegas and you're a certain age and perhaps a certain gender, you're looking for Taylor Swift. Maybe I'll see her from a distance somewhere. Now, if you don't know who that is, don't check it out, okay? If you're in Iowa City in this season right now, you're thinking, I wonder if Caitlin Clark might actually be visiting the restaurant where I am. And you're thinking perhaps there'll be a little visual of her. And in a week, if you're up in Sumner, Iowa, you might actually wonder if you might see Brock Purdy. He's engaged to a girl from Sumner, which is just up the road here. And we're all excited because we just might see him in all these crowds. Again, try to put it in context here. Try to put it in context and say, hey, listen, these people are looking for Jesus and they're excited. They're stirred up. It's the topic of conversation. Sometimes that's exactly what Jesus does. He just sort of fires us up, and we come to a worship service and we leave sort of fired up because we're excited about who he is and what he's done and all that kind of stuff, but it never really gets into our hearts. The fourth response, that's the third response. Belief, defensive anger, excitement. Fourth, encouragement. Last Sunday was, for our family, it was particularly relevant that we'd get to hear Josue describe John 11, because we had just passed on a dear friend and sister-in-law to heaven. And the resurrection story is especially relevant. And so John 11 was especially encouraging to us. And the whole issue of Jesus performing miracles and actually demonstrating the fact that there is a resurrection and he says, I am the resurrection and the life, and he who believes in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live, and whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. And then he asks the question, do you believe this? And he's talking to Mary and Martha, the sisters of Lazarus. It was an encouragement. A lot of things happen when you get older, and I'll write a book about it someday, but everybody knows it. It's in Ecclesiastes chapter 13. There's a great, great description there. One thing is, all the print is small, and there's never enough light. The print is small, there's never enough light. But the second thing that happens is, I don't know, I'm not sure why this is. I tend to get more emotional. I don't know if I had a heart attack and I didn't know it, or what the deal was along the way, but I just tend to get a little bit more emotional. So I think, what? I'm trying to excuse my behavior now, okay? What would happen if Jesus walked in here? What would happen if Jesus appeared in your life? Would you sort of cower away? Or would you be drawn to him? And it might be a mix of both. It just might be. But nonetheless, our reaction to his miracle of the resurrection of Lazarus ought to draw us close. It's an encouragement. Now, chapter 12, okay? The agenda says I have to get through chapter 12, verse 11. Some of you are looking at your clock. I had one young man, older guy. He kept a clock on me every time he visited. Now, he was a visitor. He's in heaven now, so he doesn't care about the clock. But he would tell me, Dan, that was a little long today. Or whatever. And I would, yeah. He's gone. I don't have to hear that anymore. And don't any of you take his place. Chapter 12, verse 1. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus arrived at Bethany, where Lazarus lived. This is just a couple miles outside of Jerusalem, just on the other side of the Mount of Olives, where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. And here a dinner was given in Jesus' honor, and Martha served while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. And then Mary took about a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume, and she poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. Here's the scene. In the room, Jesus, Lazarus. What a story. What a story he had to tell. But anyway, Lazarus, disciples, Mary, Martha. Probably the owner of the home they were in was Simon the leper. Now we have two other records of this story found in Matthew and Mark. Simon, I would suspect, was healed by Jesus. And they're having an intimate time together. And then Mary demonstrates the fifth response to Jesus in this context, and that is radical worship, just radical worship. She takes a pop can, well, it wasn't a pop can, but about the size of a pop can, a little bit smaller than our pound, and pure nard. Now, that's an odd name. They could have picked a better name for it. Oh, nard just sounds... Let's go on. It was costly. It was used as an investment. It was imported. It was probably worth, in today's dollars, probably worth $40,000. And she breaks the container, the neck, and pours it all over Jesus. The other two stories tell us it's more than just his feet. It was his head and everything. Now, if that had happened and I was being doused, I would have thought it was a prank. And then she wipes his feet with her hair. Feet and hair, this hair, don't go together. And in a few days, in just a few days, Jesus is going to give an illustration of how stinky and dirty and smelly and sort of humble and, servitude kind of attitude happens when you're working with feet, and he will demonstrate the whole foot washing thing. But Mary offers a true gift. And the scent filled the room, and it impacted everybody. Now, there are a few things that are still going for me in this day. And one is I have a good sense of smell. I really have a great sense of smell. But it can get me in trouble at times. Lee will start preparing lunch right after breakfast, and I have to get out of the room because I can't handle that smell yet. I will in a bit. My stomach everything will work together and so on, but it's not bacon, it's something else. Bacon, okay, which is the breakfast food. So bacon fits with breakfast, and if you're cooking something else, let me get out. I can almost vomit. And Lee says, that's your problem. And we all know about nose blindness, where, well, there are a lot of stories, but I'm not going to go there. Just you're in a room, and you notice that there's some rather foul odors in the room, but eventually they just seem to go away. No, what happened is your nose got used to it. And the minute somebody else walks into the room, they're thinking, what is this foul odor? So we have this condition called nose blindness. We get used to it and then we just don't even notice it anymore. But I want to point out something, that this perfume, this scent, was so strong and so valuable that it likely carried, along with the robes of Jesus, until the guys at the foot of the cross are throwing dice. Who gets the robe? This is expensive. Who gets the robe? And in that moment, they're still enjoying, if that's the right word, the worship, the radical worship that came from Mary. Verse 4. But one of the disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, said, "Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages." He didn't say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief as keeper of the money bag, and he used to help himself to what was put in it. So he took some Judas, income off of the treasury bag, and the money could have been put in the treasury bag, and he could have had a little bit more. And so Judas's response to this act by Mary is, "What's in it for me? What's in it for me?" He's selfish. I don't find it real hard to spend on occasion extravagantly for myself. I mean, you only go around once. And so we just let the kids know. We send out a text saying, "Well, we're spending your inheritance." And hopefully they'll understand. But we're talking here about an extravagant, radical worship which provided no benefit to Mary herself. Folks, radical, extravagant worship is only this direction. And here we are thinking, well, what can I benefit? What can I benefit out of this situation here? I mean, isn't there something in it for me? Just like Judas did. Jesus was gracious. Here's what he said. Look at verse 7. "Leave her alone," Jesus replied. "It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. You'll always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me." Meanwhile, a large crowd of Jews found out that Jesus was there and came not only because of him, but also to see Lazarus, whom he'd raised from the dead. And so the chief priests made plans to kill Lazarus as well. Kind of forgot that detail of the story, didn't you? For on account of Lazarus, many of the Jews were going over to Jesus and putting their faith in him. What was Mary's motive to demonstrate radical worship? Just to worship? Just to worship? There is a little detail in one of the other Gospels that says this. Mary didn't know this, but the detail is that every time people would share the gospel, they would share the story of Mary anointing Jesus' body just before his crucifixion. What do we learn? I don't know which one of these responses is yours. Maybe at certain seasons of life, and even when I hear these testimonies, I realize that in certain seasons of life, it could be that this was your response, and then this was your response, and then this was your response, and so on. But I would like to be found responding just like Mary did. And I think, Dan, are you ever involved in radical worship? Are you ever involved in radical worship? The tabernacle in the Old Testament was not a rundown tent. It was an expensive tent. The temple that Solomon built, incredible amounts of money spent on that building. Art, music, beauty. You walk into the European cathedrals and you think, wow, these guys were extravagant in trying to, point something that directed people heavenward. And then you ask things like, has anybody come to Christ in this building in the last 100 years? And what's that mean? Sort of thing. And so what happened is that the the way we're supposed to, the objects we use to worship God become objects of worship themselves. You know, when Mary broke that perfume over Jesus, it wasn't like, let's do a selfie. Look at me pouring perfume on Jesus. Folks, we ought to make the most of opportunities to be extravagant. On occasion. When Jesus said, he said, you'll always have the poor among you, but you'll not always have me. No, he gives instructions that we should care for the poor. But there are times, every so often, when we, without restriction, with abandon, worship Jesus. And those opportunities may only come occasionally. So I guess I'd ask this question, and how you apply it, it's going to be up to you. Do you worship our Lord with hot dogs and chips and general admission tickets and C grades and Chevys? Or with filet mignons and skybox seats and A+s and BMWs? We have a memory for you, a memory aid. When you walk out of here, out of those sets of doors, we have a bookmark for you. It's got a little spot of nard on it. It's pretty neat. Take one. Extravagant worship. Oh, not just limited for this moment between 9 o'clock and 11 o'clock on a Sunday morning, but all of life. Look to Jesus. Break a bottle of perfume because he's worth it. Would you pray? Would you bow your heads? Lord, we have a moment to reflect on all those responses to the miracle of the resurrection of Lazarus. And I think we find ourselves falling short of perhaps the response of Mary. I can't imagine dumping a year's worth of wages on anybody, including Jesus. But I want you, Lord, to, encourage my heart to recognize how important that is and how great an example Mary has provided for us. And then, Lord, help me to figure out what that means in my world. I remember, Lord, when I was a kid singing a song, give of your best to the Master. Give of the strength of your youth. I guess that's what we need to do. Give you our best. Now you can keep your eyes closed, or you can look downward, or you can look up, but just stay seated and listen and reflect on this song.